A number of people have tried to dismiss the plan, which is kind of curious because both Peter Orszag, the budget director, and the President of the United States have said that it was serious. So let's be serious about the plan today. Let's give Paul Ryan an opportunity to describe it before we decide what parts we like and we don't like. And hence, he's here today to do that. When he's through, we will have a panel that I will introduce at the appropriate time to help start this process of considering the plan in detail from as many sides as possible. So, Congressman Ryan, thank you very much for coming. The mic is yours.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. So let me have this. Oh, okay. Oh, wow. Okay. I was going to say, are we going to use these little screens up here? I didn't think that would be easy to do. I'm going to give a PowerPoint presentation, if you couldn't tell already. And maybe the lights will come down here so you can see it. Good morning, and thank you for having me here. I feel like I've come a little bit out of my cocoon over at Heritage Foundation to come here to Brookings. That's the joke I always give when I come over to Brookings. This is like my fourth or fifth time over here in just the last year. So I really appreciate the invitation. Ron, thanks so much, and Alice, and those of you at Brookings. It's really, really a pleasure to be here. What I want to do is walk through basically a PowerPoint, which I walk my constituents through, the last round of town hall meetings I did, and kind of explain where we're headed, what are our options, and what have I proposed as just my modest attempt to get this debate going, and what are the trade-offs involved. And so let's think about first, where are we now? Well, right now, we're a jobless recovery. I wouldn't even necessarily call this a recovery. There's threats of double dip. We've lost 7.5 million jobs since the recession began, 2.7 million since stimulus, unemployment's at about 9.5%. Our deficit's $1.5 trillion. So take a look at where our deficits are right now. I'm not necessarily saying this is the administration's fault and everybody's fault. They inherited a very difficult situation. But look at the size of the deficits we have here. They go down because of some things that happen automatically in the baseline, and then they go right back up to around $1 trillion. Problem is, when you stack up these kinds of deficits year over year over year, you really do have a huge, huge debt problem, and that's before all of the entitlement explosion occurs. And the thing that's so unique about the debt this time around is we're not owing it to ourselves. You know, my grandfather was a Navy man in World War II. He used to always tell me, stories of back that time when my mother would go out and collect tires for the rubber sales and all of the things that happened. People bought war bonds, and we floated debt to ourselves. That's not the case where we are right now. Let's take a look at foreign holdings of our debt. Let's just go back to 1970. Foreign holdings of our debt were 5%. 1990, our debt was $2.4 trillion. Foreign holdings were 19%. Take a look at foreign holdings right now. 47% of our debt is held by other countries. Biggest one is China. This is not, and I'm not trying to make a protectionist, isolationist statement. I'm simply trying to say when about half of your government is being cash flowed by other countries who may not have your best interest in mind, you are doing damage to your sovereignty. You are doing damage to your ability to control your own destiny as a country, and it is an unsustainable path that we are on. So that's where we are right now. Where are we headed? Well, we're going to have a tidal wave of debt in our path. And when I've mentioned World War II, we have had large debt burdens before. We have had a history of having to borrow. But typically, we've had to borrow for certain things, such as world wars. We've gone up with a big debt, and then we've paid them right back off. And what happens is the credit markets, knowing that these things are temporary, give you enough breathing room to do the kind of borrowing. And so if you take a look at, this thing's off. If you look at the little screens on the side, you can take a look at where we were. This thing doesn't have a laser pointer. If you take a look at World War II, we went up to about 100% of GDP. Then we paid it down, and then we went up for the Cold War, and then the peace dividend came back. We went back down a little bit. And so we've generally had what most economists would call acceptable levels of debt. 60%, you're getting into the tough area. You're not even allowed in the Maastricht Treaty. 90%, if you look at the Rogoff study, you look at the Reinhardt study, you're really starting to do damage to your economy at 90% of GDP. You're starting to slow it down, reduce jobs, reduce prosperity, and you're really putting your economy on a very, very difficult path. Take a look at what CBO is telling us is the debt outlook in the future. I guess the reason this is difficult is because the scale is so tough. In 2081, our debt is going to be about 750% of gross domestic product. These reflect the most recent CBO long-term budget outlook. This is where we are headed right now based upon our objective fiscal authorities if we do nothing. This doesn't even, in my opinion, reflect the true consequences of the new health care law or other things that may or may not be occurring. This is where we're headed. It is completely unsustainable. It will crash our economy, and this is really sort of an irrefutable point. What is driving all of this? Well, you can do a better job of stacking these charts, but it's basically entitlement spending. And when I throw entitlements, I'm talking about borrowing and the costs associated with borrowing. The interest on our debt alone in this budget window we are in goes from $200 billion to about $1 trillion if we have low interest rates, if we have higher interest rates. If our interest rates go back to where we were in the average of the 80s, that's about $5.4 trillion more in just additional interest payments over the next 10 years. And so we know what's really driving this are the entitlement programs and the interest associated with the borrowing that occurs with that because of all of this debt. Now, I think CBO has most recently done some very effective analysis. The CMS actuary has done it so as well, which is it's a combination, the biggest driver of this thing, of aging in America, of demographics, of boomers going to retire, of going from approximately 40 million retirees to approximately 80 million retirees. It's also a function of health care costs. One doesn't overwhelm the other. They're pretty much even if you take a look at the most recent analysis from CBO and others. The point I'm simply trying to make is we know why this debt is going up. We see this coming. And the question is, are we going to do something about it or not? I remember October 2008 like it was yesterday, serving in Congress and having the credit markets just crash, having the credit spreads seize up when Lehman Brothers went down and we, quote, unquote, broke the buck. We had the Treasury Secretary and the Federal Reserve Chairman rush up to the Hill in a panic. And that was a financial crisis that kind of snuck up on us and caught us off guard. And that was a very ugly episode. And we had to cobble together quick response legislation, TARP, and do some other things since then. And it really took what was then a fledgling economy and turned it into a very difficult, the deepest recession we've had in a couple of generations. Well, that one got us by surprise. This one is the most predictable economic crisis you could have actually ever charted. And this will make that kind of a crisis pale in comparison. And so when you take a look at what is required to actually fix this problem, I asked the Congressional Budget Office, well, what if we just raise taxes? What if we just, go through the income tax system and try to tax our way out of these fiscal problems to pay for this kind of a debt we're going to have, to pay for the explosion in entitlement obligations that are occurring? Well, here are two things, and I'll just read them off to you. The current low rate, the 10% bracket, by the time my three kids are my age, I'm 40 years old, and my children are 5, 7, and 8 years old. By the time they're my age, the lowest rate goes to 19%. The middle income tax rate for middle income taxpayers goes to 47%. And the top rate, which is the one that most of the small businesses pay, goes to 66%. That's in the middle part of the century. By the end of the century, the lowest rate goes to 25%. The middle income tax rate goes to 66%. And the top rate goes to 88%. Now, of course, you can't have a flourishing, growing, prosperous economy with tax rates like that. The point I'm simply trying to make with this is you really can't tax your way out of this problem. It is not possible. It is unsustainable. It will crash the economy, and it just doesn't add up at the end of the day in the first place. This is obviously a static analysis. It doesn't incorporate the fact that you would crash the economy well before that. So the question is, how does all of this end if we don't do something about it? Well, we have a good cautionary tale in front of us, Europe and Greece. Now, what I would argue is that this is the result of government spending that has hit Europe with a debt crisis. In particular, it was basically discovered that the Greeks were sort of cooking the books, disguising their numbers, and when it was truly revealed as to the depth of their debt problems, that's where this thing really started hitting. Then we realized the other pigs, Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain, had their own problems. They were massaging their numbers as well, and we went into a debt crisis. The best column or description I saw was Robert Samuelson, who basically said, quote, the Greek tragedy was the death spiral of the welfare state. And so where we are now is a situation where overseas they have to impose these deep, painful austerity plans. cutting benefits for existing recipients of their entitlements, cutting benefits for existing retirees, and imposing economically painful, job-destroying tax increases on their economy at this time. That's because they waited till the end to fix their problem. So could that happen here in the United States? Well, this is the most recent study by the International Monetary Fund. And they do an apples-to-apples comparison by looking at gross debt. That's what the Reinhardt and Rogoff study does as well. And the question is could America go down the path of the pigs, of Europe? Well, take a look at where our debt is right here. Right now, our debt, our gross debt, is about 89% of our economy. We are actually higher than a few of these other countries. If you take a look at Spain, we're higher. If you take a look at Ireland, we're higher. If you take a look at Portugal, we're higher. And in 5 years, under the CBO long-term projection, we're going to be right up there with Greece and Italy. And so it is folly to assume that this cannot happen to America. We have other privileges, such as the world's reserve currency. We have other advantages, such as the deep resiliency of our economy. But we should not lull ourselves into a sense of complacency that this is not the fate that awaits us if we don't get our hand around this problem. So how do you avoid this fate? What do we do about it? And this is what I was talking about. And I really believe we're at sort of the proverbial fork in the road. And the question is not how things are going to change. Things are going to change. The question is, do we do it with an eye toward prosperity, or do we allow the political impasse to occur, to continue, and do we end up kicking the can down the road, which clearly results in austerity? And so the choice before America right now is really a prosperity plan or an austerity plan. And so what do I mean when I say that? That's why I put out this Roadmap for America's Future. Now, the Roadmap for America's Future was my attempt to basically do a couple of things. Number one, it became clear to me that we were just going to be continuing to hit each other as two political parties, where if you step out with anything different, anything bold, anything remotely considered politically risky, the other party will shoot you in the next election, and you'll lose, and nobody will follow, and we come to an impasse. And that has been where our politics have been for a long time. So I wanted to put a plan out there, not necessarily to say that I've got it all figured out and have all of these answers. I wanted to put a plan out there saying, here's how I would do it. Please come up with yours so we could get this debate going, so we could have more people coming up with their plans, so we can get down to the business of debating how best to fix this problem. Unfortunately, when I jumped in the pool and encouraged other people to jump in the pool, we haven't had many other folks swimming around. And that's from both sides of the aisle, I would say. So here is what this plan does. In the macro sense, measuring against the CBO alternative scenario, which is really the best, most accurate measurement of reality we have to measure ourselves off of, this is a chart of government spending as a percentage of GDP. Because of the factors I mentioned before, the explosion of entitlements, interest on debt, all of those other things, our government is growing at such a fast pace. By the time my 3 children are my age, we will go from having government, which was taking about 20 cents out of every dollar in America, made in America, to spend on the federal government, to 40 cents out of every dollar, and way on beyond that. So if you take a look at the path we are on, the current policy, an unsustainable sense where the government will take more and more and more resources out of the private economy, reducing prosperity, giving us our own version of a debt crisis. And the roadmap does this according to CBO, and here's basically what it does. The way I look at this is either we get ahead of this now, preempt a debt crisis, and put in place the building blocks for prosperity, or we kick the can down the road and do painful things that lead to austerity. And what I mean when I say that is, in the roadmap, if you act soon, you don't have to affect current seniors. You don't have to change Medicare and Social Security for people who are 55 and above. So our proposals say if you're 55 or above, or if you're a person in or near retirement, we're not going to pull the rug out from under you. You've already organized and planned your lives around these programs. So rest assured that not only are we not going to take these things away or change them, we're actually going to guarantee that those benefits will be payable. But if you're like me in the X generation and Y generation and on down, if you're below 54 years of age, you already really kind of know that these programs can't sustain themselves. They simply can't be paid. They can't occur as we know them to be today. And so let's reform these programs and put them in a position so that they actually can be payable, so that they're solvent and sustainable, and so that they don't end up crashing our economy with a debt crisis. How would I propose to do that? Well, let's think about sort of the consensus values we've achieved in this society. I'm talking about Republicans and Democrats, people right of center, people left of center. Do we believe that we ought to have a safety net in this country? Yes. Do we believe that we ought to have a safety net in this country that helps people who cannot help themselves and that helps people who are temporarily down on their luck? Yes, we do. I think that's consensus. Okay, great. So how do you do this? Do we believe that we ought to advance the mission of health and retirement security in America so that these are valuable missions, social insurance strategies created in the 20th century? It's just the way that they were created are going to bankrupt us in the 21st century. But the mission of these insurance strategies are something that most of us agree with. I come from Wisconsin. A lot of these ideas came from Wisconsin to begin with. And so the answer is yes again. And so let's come up with a system that fulfills the mission of health and retirement security for all Americans. But let's do it in a way that pays off our national debt, that keeps our size of government low and limited so that we can maximize prosperity and economic opportunity. And so let's also recognize that we're in the 21st century global economy. We need to have the kinds of economic policies, particularly in the tax area, that make us ultra competitive, that make our businesses want to keep locating themselves in America, that makes it easier and preferable for people to build things in America and export them overseas so that we can maintain very high standards of living. Because at the end of the day, this is all about whether or not we keep the American legacy intact, whether or not we fulfill the obligation that our folks gave to us, which is each generation tackles the challenges in front of itself so that the next generation is better off. You know, my dad told me two things when I was a kid growing up. You're either part of the problem or part of the solution. He usually told me that when I was being part of the problem. And he also said, each generation in this country takes its challenges seriously, fixes the problems so the next generation is better off. Well, that's simply what I'm trying to do. And so the roadmap is basically taking these important missions and changing them in a gradual, phased-in way so that they're fulfillable, sustainable, and so that they preserve the other key thing, restoring the American legacy of leaving the next generation better off. In a policy wonkish description, it is a defined benefits safety net with a defined contribution system on top. And so when you take a look at the health care stuff, Medicare, Medicaid, and the health care system for the under 65 population in addition to that, it is a system that says there's a finite amount of money that government can take from the economy and give to people. Let's figure out how to do that in a way that honors our values. More money for low-income people, more money for people who are sick with chronic diseases, with pre-existing conditions, and not as much money for wealthy people. That's the basic values I put into this plan. So if you're low income, you've got double the assistance to go into an exchange in your state to buy comprehensive health insurance. If you have a pre-existing condition, a chronic disease, you will have additional risk-adjusted subsidies so that you can get affordable health insurance. On Medicare, it basically says for the individuals who are 54 and below, when they turn a retirement age, they will have a payment that will go to them, just like I do as a congressman. And they will get a book from the federal government, from Medicare, just like I do as a congressman from the Office of Personnel Management. And I'll have a list of private plans. That's what I have right now. You'll have a list of Medicare certified plans, and you'll take your payment and apply to the plan to meet your needs. If you're low income, all of your out-of-pocket costs will be covered. If you are sick and getting sicker, you'll get more assistance to stabilize your rates. And if you're a wealthy person, you won't get as much of a payment because you're wealthy and you can afford more. That's basically what we propose to do, and carrying this out in the future makes these programs absolutely sustainable. That's just not my opinion. That's what CBO has certified. That's what the actuaries at HHS have certified. And so to me, take our values, move them forward. We know that we can't pay for everything for everybody, so where and who in society do we want to help the most, and who can afford to be helped less? Replicate that going forward, and that brings us to the point where we can actually get this thing under control. I won't go into the great elaborate details of tax and Social Security other than to say Social Security is the same story. If you're 55 and above, no change. If you're below 55, number one, we're going to make some benefit changes that protect those who are least among us, that actually fix the safety net so nobody lives under the poverty line, and we have a system that's sustainable. And if you want, as a younger person, to take a third of your payroll taxes and put in a plan just like I have as a congressman, a thrift savings plan, not a privatized account, but a plan managed and run by the Social Security Administration in safe index accounts, giving you the power and the ability to harness the power of compound interest, to have a nest egg that's your property that you own and control, to get you a better rate of return and better retirement benefits. And if you pass away, it goes to your family, not back to the government. That's your choice if you want to have it. If you want to stay in the traditional plan, you can. On tax reform, I would simply say there are many different ways of doing this, at getting at the same objective, but the key ought to be this. Let's have a plan that gets our economy really competitive in the global economy. We don't merely want to survive globalization in the 21st century economy. We want to lead it. We want to shape it. We want to be on top of it so that we can help spread prosperity as deeply and widely in this society as much as possible, so that the 21st century is one where the limits and boundaries of prosperity of the 20th century are shattered, and we bring more prosperity and economic growth to people who have not yet seen it. That is basically the ideas behind this. I do not believe that these are ultra-conservative reforms. I think they're basically practical, common sense things. We embrace a progressive tax structure. I think that is something that is what many centrists believe in. We embrace a safety net. We help those who are least among us, and we do it in a way that's sustainable. And so at the end of the day, what this is really all about is whether or not we're fulfilling the American legacy. And here's what we know. The red line down here is the CBO's measurement of the current policy trajectory. And this is what we call standard of livings, or economic growth per capita. And what we know for the first time in our nation's history is we are, without a doubt, giving the next generation a lower standard of living. We are giving the young people in the society less opportunities, a lower chance at a better life. That we've never done before. And so we know this is coming. It's so funny because when you see this red line that ends, it's simply because the computer basically crashes, the model crashes effectively at CBO, and this is a year-old data. In a couple of months ago, or a month ago, they gave us numbers that says in 2027, the CBO model can't measure the economy going forward because they can't conceive of the levels of debt that are going to happen and how the economy can accommodate that. What I'm trying to say is we know the path we're on is a dangerous one. We know it's going to give us a lower standard of living. And what the roadmap does, and anything that's like the roadmap would do, is give us an ever higher increase in standard of living for future generations. Economic growth per person, because we preempted debt crisis, get ahead of this, put in place plans for prosperity and economic vitality and competitiveness in the 21st century global economy, and get these entitlements under control, gives us that path where we finally reconnect ourselves with the American legacy of leaving everybody better off. My point in doing this is to do this. It is not too late for America to get itself back. It is not too late for us to see this coming, prevent it from happening, and make us all the better off. Why don't we do it on our terms now, where we don't hurt people, where people who are already on these programs do not get affected? Let's do it now, so that's the outcome. If we keep engaging in political paralysis, if we keep running campaigns against each other and locking up the system, then we end up just simply kicking the can down the road, and it's Greek-like austerity. It's cuts to people who are already living on these benefits. It is cuts to those who are least among us. And it's deep tax increases, which will shut down our economy and reduce economic opportunity for people entering the workforce or people who have been laid off. That's really the choice, prosperity versus austerity. You act now, you'll make it off better. And that's the point. What I'm trying to do is get this debate going, and I appreciate the invitation from Brookings, and thank you very much.